Imagine that you're on a boat trip through the islands of Indonesia. You're in a true tropical paradise, surrounded by incredible wildlife like rhinos, elephants, tigers, and woodpeckers. Suddenly, as you cross an invisible line, everything changes dramatically. You arrive at another island that feels like a completely different world. It's drier, more arid, and the animals are strange and exotic. You see marsupials, Komodo dragons, and cockatoos. And then comes the question, how can there be such a noticeable difference in biodiversity between islands so close to each other? Come with me because I'm going to show you that this is real and explain how it happens. Indonesia is a fascinating country with a population of over 280 million people, even more than Brazil. There, people speak over 700 different languages and belong to more than 1,300 distinct ethnic groups. But beyond this impressive cultural diversity, Indonesia's fauna and flora are also extremely rich, with thousands of unique and exotic species. And if you want to explore this and other destinations but are short on money, I've got an opportunity for you in the pinned comment. What makes Indonesia even more interesting is that these species aren't distributed evenly across its islands. In fact, there is a very clear boundary where the animals on one side are completely different from the animals on the other side. This point is known as a biogeographic boundary. And in the Indonesian archipelago, this line is called the Wallace Line. The Wallace Line was first defined in 1859 by Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist who also co-authored the theory of natural selection alongside Charles Darwin. Wallace spent 8 years exploring the Indonesian islands, collecting and studying thousands of animals and plants. It was during this journey that he came up with one of the most important ideas in the history of science, the theory of natural selection. Wallace arrived at this idea during a feverish dream while he was sick with malaria on one of the archipelago's islands. He wrote an article about his theory and sent it to Charles Darwin, another British naturalist who was working on the same idea. Darwin was impressed by Wallace's work and acknowledged that he had come to the same conclusion. The two decided to publish their papers together, giving rise to the theory of evolution by natural selection. Although he was overshadowed by Darwin in this field, the second best idea Wallace had during his journey was the realization of the Wallace Line's existence. He noticed that as he moved from one island to another, the animal life changed dramatically. For example, between the islands of Bali and Lombok, which are separated by a channel only 30 kilometers wide, he saw a vast difference in bird and mammal species. The same happened between the islands of Borneo and Sulawesi, separated by a 120-kilometer strait. Wallace was intrigued by this phenomenon and began drawing an imaginary line on the map that passed through both straits. This line became known as the Wallace Line, marking the boundary between two completely distinct biodiversity worlds. On the western side of the Wallace Line, the islands have fauna typical of Asia. There, you'll find elephants, tigers, rhinos, orangutans, and many other animals familiar to us. Meanwhile, on the eastern side, the islands have fauna typical of Australia, with Komodo dragons, white cockatoos, babirussas, and other exotic animals. But how is this possible? Wallace realized that it wasn't just a matter of distance, climate, or vegetation, as the islands were very similar in these aspects. He concluded that the Wallace Line was not just a biological boundary, but also a geological one. He recognized that the geological past shapes the biological present. The distribution of living species today reflects geological events from the past. These concepts were relatively new in Wallace's time and often overlooked. But by adopting this geological perspective, he concluded that in the past, the Western Islands were all connected to each other and to the Asian continent. Similarly, the Eastern Islands were linked to the Australian continent. Wallace deduced that the deeper waters and strong currents between these two regions likely prevented many species from crossing from one side of the line to the other. Even many species of birds and flying insects were unable to make it across this stretch of open ocean. Wallace put together many pieces of the puzzle, but neither he nor other scientists of his time were anywhere close to discovering the piece that would complete the whole picture: the theory of plate tectonics. The surface of our planet is dynamic, made up of large plates that move and collide over vast geological periods. This concept was only widely accepted in the late 1960s after Wallace's death. Plate tectonics are responsible for reshaping the planet in many ways, including the formation and deformation of continents, the emergence of islands, and the creation of mountain ranges. Studies have shown that the Malay archipelago is one of the most tectonically complex regions in the world, where several plates converge. This complexity results not only in frequent volcanic and seismic activity, but also in the unique contrasts in its wildlife. In the 1980s, scientists confirmed that the Wallace Line is essentially the result of tectonic activity. Wallace was correct in identifying that, in the distant past, two continental masses existed on either side of this line. Although Wallace didn't know it at the time, these continents used to be much further apart than they are now. The Sahul continent, on the eastern side of the line, encompassed what are now known as Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea, and other islands. Around 20 to 25 million years ago, the Sahul continent slowly moved closer to the Asian continental shelf called Sunda, bringing with it a distinct community of birds, reptiles, and marsupials. Although the species on either side are now neighbors, they evolved separately for millions of years, only coming into proximity in evolutionary terms when sea levels dropped during the most recent ice ages, around 18,000 years ago. During these ice ages, the Sunda and Sahul landmasses partially emerged, forming large land bridges. It was through these newly formed paths that Asian and Australian species colonized the Indonesian islands. Asian species reached the islands on the western side of the Wallace Line, connected to the Sunda continent. Australian species reached the islands on the eastern side of the Wallace Line, connected to the Sahul continent. But between these two, there was a chain of volcanic islands in deeper waters that never fully connected to either continent. These islands make up the Wallacea region, which includes Lombok, Timor, and others. The Wallacea region was like a blank ecological canvas, waiting to be filled by any species capable of reaching it. Predominantly, the species that managed this feat came from the Australian side, as the Wallace Line acted as a barrier, preventing Asian species from reaching this area. Over time, the climate warmed, the ice melted, and sea levels rose, flooding the lower areas of the Sunda and Sahul regions, forming the islands we know today. The animals that lived in these higher regions, which later became islands, were isolated from their mainland relatives and began to adapt to their new conditions. This led to the development of new species, different from the original ones. For example, the elephants that once roamed the Sunda region gave rise to the pygmy elephants of Borneo, which are smaller and have rounder ears. The lizards that lived in Sahul evolved into the Komodo dragons, becoming larger and developing a powerful venomous bite. Not all the islands were colonized by the same animals, which is why some islands have more diverse wildlife than others. This uneven distribution of animals across the islands is what makes the Wallace Line so distinct and remarkable. It shows how geography and history influence biodiversity and evolution. However, the Wallace Line is not perfect. It doesn't account for all the differences between the islands. For instance, it doesn't explain why some islands have endemic species, meaning species that exist only on that specific island and nowhere else, like the Sumatran orangutan, found only on the island of Sumatra. These endemic species result from other factors, such as genetic drift, sexual selection, sympatric speciation, or allopatric speciation. These are more complex concepts involving genetic variations, reproductive isolation, and local adaptations. Therefore, the Wallace Line is not an absolute and unchanging barrier. It is an imaginary line that represents a general trend, but it may have exceptions and variations. It symbolizes the complexity and diversity of nature and serves as a tribute to the legacy of Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the greatest scientists in history.